A boy named Kurt was born in Cleveland, and from a young age, he was fascinated by this abandoned factory on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio, that used to be a prominent rubber company, but in the late 1970s, when they closed down business, nobody else leased the factory space, and so for decades, it remained untouched. He really wanted to see what was inside, but his dad would never take him, saying it was way too dangerous to go in there. Then, in the late 1990s, when Kurt was in high school, he happened to be walking by the factory after leaving a friend's house, and he stopped and he looked at his watch, and it was 8 p.m. He didn't have to be home for about an hour and a half, and he looked up at the crumbling brick building and he thought to himself, you know what? It's now or never. I have to see what's inside of there. And so he walks right up to the factory. There's no fences around it to stop him. And he gets up there and he sees that all the doors are sealed shut. So he's a little bit disheartened and he starts walking around the property. And when he gets to the backside, he sees on one of the corners of the building, the concrete has just fallen off, exposing a fairly large hole in the side of the building that he could just walk right through. And so he slipped through and he looked inside this building that he's been thinking about for years and years and years. And he would say it was just so cool. There were all these boats that had just been left in storage inside of this factory and then were apparently forgotten about. There were all these conveyor belts and big pieces of factory equipment that had just been kind of left out on the floor, and no one thought to break them down or even try to sell them. And then, like any other good abandoned building, there was lots of paraphernalia scattered all over the ground. And so for the next hour, Kurt just explored the first floor and made his way up to the second floor where the manager's office was. And at some point, he looked at his watch and it was getting late and he realized he needed to leave. And so as he was getting ready to leave, he could have sworn he heard the sound of music being played from somewhere in the factory. And so he stopped and he turned around and he just listened for a second to see if he really was hearing music. And he was. It was someone playing the blues somewhere in the factory. Now that there was some mystery about what was in here, he couldn't just leave. He had to go look and see where that music was coming from. And so Kurt began walking across the factory floor in the direction where he thought this music was coming from, and he reached a wall that was covered by a big blue tarp, and that's where it seemed to be coming from. And so he went up to put his ear against this wall, and when he did, he almost fell into the tarp, because behind the tarp was actually a stairwell that led down into the basement. And so he grabs the tarp and he pulls it aside and he starts looking downstairs, and he can tell there's a light on down there. And so he's telling himself, okay, it's possible someone could be down there. He pulls the tarp completely aside, he steps into the stairwell, and he begins walking down. And from his perspective, he would not be able to see any of the basement until he got all the way to the bottom. And when he got to the bottom, he could only turn left. Turning right was just a dead end. Left was towards the main section of the basement. And so he goes all the way down the steps. His heart is racing because he's half expecting to see someone come running up to him. He takes a deep breath, and then very slowly he kind of pokes his head around the corner and gets a look inside the basement. It's a very odd scene in there, but there doesn't appear to be any people. And so Kurt took the last couple of steps down to the bottom. He turned the corner and actually got a full look at the basement. And sitting in the middle of the room is a cassette player with the play button pressed down that's playing the music. So he's found the origin of the music. And then he starts looking around and realizes on all of the walls are pieces of paper, hundreds of them, that have all been plastered to the walls that all say the exact same 3 words. She gotta run. They're everywhere. Then he looks in the back corner and he sees there is this large wooden animal sculpture, although he can't tell what kind of animal it is, but clearly someone has been hacking at it with a hammer or a saw or maybe both, and it's been burned. It looks like someone's been taking a lot of frustration out on it. And then in the other corner, away from this animal sculpture, was this chair that appeared to have been removed from a school desk, and it was angled towards the corner of the room. And then behind it on the ground was this massive stack of VHS tapes, and each of them had a woman's name on it. And Kurt, from a distance, could only make out one name, which was Jessica, but he could clearly see there was a bunch of other tapes with different names on them. Kurt suddenly was not feeling brave anymore and wanted to get out of there immediately, because at this point, he's pretty certain that whoever's down here is not a good person. They got some bad stuff going on down here. So he turns around and he starts walking up the stairs, makes his way across the factory floor, and he finally gets to the crack in the cement and he makes his way out, and he's out to safety again. Even though Kurt was really excited about having finally explored the factory, on his walk home, it dawned on him that while he was there, someone had to have manually pressed the play button on that tape recorder that was playing the music, because it wasn't playing when he got there. So either he miraculously avoided ever making contact with this person or group of people inside of this factory while he explored it for over an hour, or the more likely scenario is as soon as Kurt walked inside, this person or group of people knew he was there and were watching him the whole time. And maybe when they hit play on that cassette player and started playing that music, that was just an attempt to lure Kurt down into the basement. Who knows what would have happened if he had stayed even longer? And who knows what's on those VHS tapes? To this day, Kurt and all of his friends are convinced he was in the presence of a serial killer.